October 14th, 1913, 8:10 a.m. Universal Colliery, Senghenydd, South Wales. Edward Shaw, 47 years old, paused at the pit head and looked back at the valley one last time before descending. The autumn sun was breaking through the morning mist, casting long shadows across the rows of miners' cottages that clung to the hillside like barnacles on a ship's hull. His son, George, 19 years old, stood beside him, lunch tin in hand, ready for his third month underground. Edward had tried to talk the boy out of mining. "There's other work," he'd said. George had laughed. "Where?" "The pit's all there is, Dad. You know that." What Edward Shaw didn't know, what none of the 935 men descending into the Universal Colliery that morning knew, was that the mine's owner, Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries Limited, had received 17 separate warnings about methane gas accumulation in the previous 6 months. The company's response to each warning had been identical, a polite acknowledgement followed by absolute inaction. The irony was devastating. This wasn't even the Universal Colliery's first disaster. On May 24, 1901, exactly 12 years earlier, an explosion in the same mine had killed 81 men. After that catastrophe, mine inspectors had recommended a complete overhaul of ventilation systems, installation of modern safety equipment, and rigorous methane monitoring. The company had installed exactly none of these recommendations. Instead, they'd paid the modest fines, reopened the mine 3 weeks later, and continued operations as before. Edward Shaw knew about the 1901 disaster. Everyone in Senghenydd did. But knowing didn't change the fundamental equation. Men needed work, the mine provided work, and in the South Wales valleys of 1913, there were no alternatives. The coal seams beneath Senghenydd were among the richest in Britain, and Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries was extracting approximately 600,000 tons of coal annually. That coal heated London homes, powered British factories, and filled the bunkers of Royal Navy warships. The company's shareholders earned handsome dividends. The miners earned enough to survive, barely. That morning, 935 men descended into darkness. Among them were fathers and sons, brothers working side by side, 3 generations of some families. The youngest was 14-year-old William Jones, officially listed as 16 on company records, a common fiction that allowed boys to work underground before the legal age. The oldest was 68-year-old Thomas Richards, who'd been mining since he was 10 years old, and whose lungs were so damaged by coal dust that he coughed blood every morning. He couldn't afford to retire. The Universal Colliery appeared modern by 1913 standards. Electric lighting in some sections. Mechanical coal cutters. Even a telephone line connecting the pit bottom to the surface. But these modern touches concealed fundamental failures in the systems that mattered most: ventilation, gas monitoring, and emergency preparedness. The mine descended to a depth of 2,000 feet, deeper than most Welsh pits. At that depth, methane gas seeped naturally from the coal seams. Methane itself is odorless, colorless, and lighter than air, which means it accumulates at the highest points of tunnels. In concentrations between 5% and 15% in air, it becomes explosively flammable. Any spark, from mining equipment, from a safety lamp, even from metal striking rock, can trigger ignition. Every mining engineer in Britain understood this. The solution was straightforward: constant ventilation to keep methane concentrations below dangerous levels, and regular monitoring with flame safety lamps that would detect gas before it reached explosive concentrations. The Universal Colliery had ventilation systems, technically speaking. They were undersized, poorly maintained, and frequently bypassed when they interfered with production quotas. William Brace, the chief mine inspector for South Wales, had personally inspected the Universal Colliery on August 3, 1913, just 10 weeks before the disaster. His report, filed with the Home Office on August 12, identified critical deficiencies. Ventilation in the eastern sections is grossly inadequate. Methane accumulation has been detected at dangerous levels in sections 4, 7, and 9. Current airflow is approximately 40,000 cubic feet per minute. For safe operations at current extraction rates, minimum required airflow is 80,000 cubic feet per minute. Immediate remedial action is essential. The report included a handwritten note at the bottom. This mine presents significant explosion risk under current conditions. Recommend suspension of operations in affected sections until ventilation is improved. Edward Shaw of the Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries Board of Directors, no relation to miner Edward Shaw, received this report on August 15. He read it at his desk in Cardiff, in an office with mahogany panelling and a view of the docks where coal from his mines was loaded onto ships. He drafted a response the same day Inspector Brace's concerns are noted. However, the suggested ventilation improvements would require suspension of operations in our most productive sections for an estimated 6–8 weeks, at a cost to the company of approximately £12,000 in lost production, plus £8,000 in equipment modifications. We believe this is an excessive response to what has been, to date, a theoretical risk. The Universal Colliery has operated continuously since 1891 without major incident since 1901. We propose to continue current operations while gradually implementing improvements over the next 18–24 months. The response was polite, professional, and entirely calculated. Edward Shaw, the director, had done the math: £20,000 in immediate costs versus the remote possibility of a disaster. And even if a disaster occurred, the company's maximum liability under existing law was approximately £300 per dead miner. Call it £30,000 if 100 men died, which seemed an absurdly pessimistic scenario. Either way, continuing operations was the financially rational choice. William Brace received this response and immediately escalated to the Home Office. He wrote directly to the Secretary of State, "The Universal Colliery represents an imminent danger to human life. I am requesting authority to close the mine pending compliance with safety requirements." The request disappeared into bureaucratic channels. The Home Office forwarded it to the Legal Department, which determined that under existing regulations mine inspectors could recommend closure but couldn't mandate it without a court order. To obtain a court order required evidence of immediate and specific danger, not merely elevated risk. Methane accumulation fell into the latter category. The legal opinion, delivered on September 23, concluded Inspector Brace lacks authority to enforce closure. Company compliance must be obtained through negotiation and persuasion. By the time this opinion filtered back to Brace, it was October 7. He immediately wrote to Lewis Merthyr Consolidated requesting an urgent meeting to discuss compliance timeline. The company scheduled the meeting for October 23, 9 days after the explosion. On the morning of October 14, the men descended as usual. The day shift started at 6 a.m. but most miners arrived early. Being late meant lost wages. By 7:30 a.m., approximately 900 men were underground, spread across the mine's extensive network of tunnels and working faces. Edward Shaw and his son George were assigned to Section 7, one of the sections specifically identified in Inspector Brace's report as having dangerous methane levels. They knew about the gas. Every miner did. They could smell it sometimes, a faint sweet odor from impurities mixed with the methane. They carried flame safety lamps designed to detect it. When methane concentrations rose, the lamp flame would change color and height. Standard procedure was to evacuate immediately if lamps showed gas presence. But standard procedure conflicted with economic reality. Methane accumulation was common in Section 7. If they evacuated every time lamps detected gas, they'd spend half their shift on the surface, earning nothing. So they'd developed informal workarounds: work quickly when gas was present, improve local ventilation by opening temporary airways, monitor lamps constantly, and hope. This morning, George Shaw noticed his lamp flame flickering strangely around 7:45 a.m. "Dad, look at this." Edward examined the lamp. The flame had developed a blue cap, a clear indicator of methane presence. "Right, we need to clear out, let the air circulate." They retreated 50 yards back down the tunnel where the ventilation was better. 10 minutes later they returned. The flame looked normal. They resumed work. This happened 3 times between 7:45 and 8 a.m. Each time they retreated, waited, returned. This was normal. This was every day. This was mining. At 8:10 a.m., in Section 4, approximately 400 yards from where the Shaws were working, a miner named Thomas Lewis was operating a mechanical coal cutter. The cutter used an electric motor to drive a rotating chain with cutting teeth. It was dangerous equipment. Sparks were common when the chain hit rock or metal debris. Standard safety protocol required shutting down cutters when gas was detected. But shutting down meant lost production, and lost production meant lost bonuses for both miners and management. Lewis had noticed gas that morning. His lamp had shown it clearly. He'd reported it to the deputy overman Samuel Davies around 7:30. Davies had checked confirmed gas presence and made a decision: keep working, but go careful. I'll increase the ventilation. Davies opened an auxiliary ventilation door which should have improved airflow through section 4. It did, slightly. Not enough, because the fundamental problem wasn't one door or one section. The entire ventilation system was undersized for the mine's current layout and extraction rate. Opening one door just redistributed insufficient airflow, improving some areas while worsening others. At 8 hours 10 minutes and 17 seconds am, the precise time was later determined by a surface clock that stopped when the explosion destroyed the mine's electrical system. Thomas Lewis's coal cutter hit a piece of metal debris embedded in the coal seam. The cutting chain generated a shower of sparks. In properly ventilated air, those sparks would have been harmless. In air containing 7% methane, right in the middle of the explosive range, they were a match touching gasoline. The methane ignited instantly. A blue flash filled section 4, traveling at approximately 1,200 feet per second. The temperature spiked to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas Lewis died before his brain could register what was happening. The thermal wave killed him in milliseconds. But the methane explosion was just the trigger. The Universal Colliery, like most deep mines, was coated in coal dust. Every surface, every timber, every inch of tunnel floor and ceiling accumulated a fine layer of pulverized coal, the residue of years of cutting, blasting, and transporting coal through confined spaces. This dust should have been regularly washed down with water or treated with stone dust to reduce its flammability. It wasn't. Water cost money. Stone dust cost money. And coal dust seemed inert, just black powder, nothing dangerous. But coal dust, when suspended in air, is not inert. It's explosive, more explosive than methane. Each particle of coal dust acts as fuel. When the methane flash erupted through section 4, it lifted decades of accumulated coal dust into suspension. The suspended dust cloud ignited within milliseconds. What happened next was a coal dust explosion, a phenomenon that makes methane explosions seem gentle by comparison. The coal dust explosion propagated through the mine like a living thing, following tunnels, turning corners, seeking oxygen and fuel. It traveled at supersonic speed, creating a pressure wave that reached 250 pounds per square inch. At that pressure, human bodies don't just die, they disintegrate. Steel support beams twisted like wire, wooden timbers vaporized. The explosion generated carbon monoxide at toxic concentrations, 14,000 parts per million in some areas, when 1,200 ppm is lethal within minutes. The explosion reached section 7 at approximately 8 hours 10 minutes and 32 seconds am, 15 seconds after the initial ignition. Edward Shaw had time to register a distant rumbling sound, time to turn toward his son, time to open his mouth to shout a warning. The pressure wave hit them like a physical wall. Edward's last conscious thought was confusion. Why was George suddenly so far away? He didn't understand that the blast had thrown his son 80 feet down the tunnel. He didn't understand that his own body was being thrown in the opposite direction. He didn't feel the coal dust ignite around him because the pressure wave had already ruptured his lungs and stopped his heart. George Shaw was killed by carbon monoxide, not the initial blast. The explosion knocked him unconscious but didn't immediately kill him. He woke in absolute darkness. His lamp had been blown out in silence so complete it seemed to press on his eardrums. He tried to breathe and couldn't. The air was gone, replaced by hot gas that burned his throat and lungs. He lasted perhaps 3 minutes before the carbon monoxide stopped his heart. On the surface, the first indication of disaster was a deep rumbling boom that shook buildings in Senghenydd village. Windows rattled. Doors swung open. Then the main shaft exhaled. A blast of hot air, smoke and debris shot 150 feet into the sky, carrying timbers, twisted metal and fragments of mining equipment. Mary Shaw was hanging laundry in her garden, the same garden where she'd kissed her husband and son goodbye 3 hours earlier. She heard the boom, saw the column of smoke rising from the pithead, and knew immediately. She dropped the washing basket and ran toward the mine, still wearing her house slippers, not feeling the stones cutting her feet. By the time she reached the pit head, hundreds of people were already there, wives, mothers, children. The entire village, it seemed, had converged on the mine entrance. The scene was chaos, people screaming, crying, trying to force their way past the barriers. The colliery manager, Edward Williams, was attempting to organize a rescue effort while simultaneously preventing panicked relatives from rushing into the mine. "We can't send anyone down yet," Williams shouted over the crowd. "The shaft might not be stable. We need to check the ventilation, make sure the air is breathable." "My husband's down there," a woman screamed. "My boys are down there." "I understand, but if we send men into poisoned air, we'll just add to the casualties. Give us 30 minutes to assess." He didn't get to finish. A group of about 20 miners who'd been on the surface, men from the night shift who hadn't yet gone home, pushed past the barriers and entered the cage that descended into the mine. "We're going," one of them said. "You can help or get out of the way." The first rescue team descended at 8:35 a.m., 25 minutes after the explosion. They emerged 6 minutes later, gasping, some vomiting, all reporting the same thing: "The air is poison. We got maybe 200 feet before we couldn't breathe. We need breathing apparatus." The Universal Colliery had exactly 12 sets of proto-breathing apparatus, primitive devices consisting of a mouthpiece connected to a reservoir of compressed oxygen. 12 sets for a mine employing 935 men. And of those 12, 5 were broken, kept in storage pending repair that had never been completed because replacement parts were expensive. 7 sets of working breathing apparatus. 7 rescuers could go down at a time. The rescue effort that followed was heroic and heartbreaking. Teams of 7 men would descend, search for 20 minutes until their oxygen ran out, and return to the surface. Then the next team would go. The process was agonizingly slow. Meanwhile, on the surface, hundreds of people waited, most already knowing but not yet accepting what the delay meant. The first survivor was brought up at 9:15 a.m. His name was James Thomas, and he'd been working in Section 12, far from the explosion's origin. He was conscious, badly burned, confused. "What happened?" he kept asking. "What was that noise?" Over the next 4 hours, 32 survivors were brought to the surface. Most had been in remote sections of the mine, partially shielded from the blast. Many had severe burns. Several had broken bones from being thrown by the pressure wave. All had carbon monoxide poisoning. 8 of the rescued men would die from their injuries over the following week, raising the final death toll. The last living man was brought up at 2:30 p.m., 6 hours after the explosion. After that, only bodies. The rescue effort continued for 8 days. Teams worked around the clock, clearing debris, shoring up collapsed tunnels, searching every branch and gallery of the massive mine complex. Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries faced exactly one legal consequence: a fine of £24 for violations of the Coal Mines Act. £24. Divided by 439 deaths, that's approximately 1 shilling per dead miner. The company paid the fine and continued operations. Civil lawsuits were filed by families of the dead miners. Under existing law, companies were liable for wrongful death only if negligence could be proven, and only to a maximum of £300 per death. Lewis Merthyr Consolidated settled most cases for amounts between £50 and £150. Total payouts to all families approximately £40,000. The company's lost production during the 8-day mine closure cost approximately £35,000. Total financial impact of killing 439 men, £75,000. Meanwhile, the company's annual profit in 1913 was £186,000. Shareholders received their usual dividend. The explosion was noted in the annual report as an unfortunate incident that temporarily reduced output in the fourth quarter. Edward Shaw, the director, retired in 1920 at age 62 with a generous pension. He died in 1933, wealthy and respected in his seaside villa in Devon. His obituary in the Times mentioned his distinguished career in the mining industry without referencing Senghenydd. William Brace, the mine inspector who tried desperately to prevent the disaster, never recovered psychologically. Colleagues reported that he became obsessed with mine safety, personally inspecting every mine in South Wales multiple times per year. He drove himself to exhaustion and suffered a mental breakdown in 1917. He recovered partially but never regained his previous energy. He died in 1947 at age 79, still blaming himself for not finding a way to force the Universal Colliery to close. Mary Shaw lived until 1963, dying at age 94. She never stopped attending the annual memorial service at Senghenydd, never stopped telling anyone who would listen that her husband and son were murdered by greed. In her final interview given to a local newspaper in 1962, she said people call it an accident. It wasn't an accident, it was murder. They knew the mine was dangerous, they were told it would explode. They chose profit over lives. That's not an accident, that's murder. The Universal Colliery reopened in 1914. It operated until 1928, extracting coal from the same seams where 439 men had died. Safety improvements were made, better ventilation, more frequent inspections, improved equipment, but these came grudgingly, implemented only under constant pressure from inspectors and threats of closure. In 1928, a fire in the Universal Colliery damaged critical infrastructure. Lewis Merthyr Consolidated evaluated repair costs against remaining coal reserves and decided closure was more economical than continued operation. The mine was permanently sealed. The company's press release announcing the closure mentioned depletion of economically extractable reserves without referencing the disaster that had killed nearly 500 men, including those who died later from injuries. Senghenydd today is a small village in South Wales, population approximately 4,000. The mine site is an empty lot, the shaft sealed, the buildings demolished. A memorial stands in the village centre, a stone monument listing 439 names plus the names of the 8 men who died later from injuries. The disaster remains the worst mining accident in British history. But what makes Senghenydd significant isn't just the death toll, it's the documentation. Unlike many industrial disasters where causes are debated and responsibility diffused, Senghenydd was perfectly predicted. William Brace's reports, sitting in company files and Home Office archives, documented exactly what would happen and when. The explosion wasn't unforeseeable, it was foreseen, documented and ignored. That documentation makes Senghenydd unique. It's a case study in the mathematics of negligence where all variables are known, the cost of prevention £20,000, the probability of disaster documented as imminent, the potential death toll estimated at 100 mine to 500 men, and the financial liability capped at £300 per death. Given these variables, Lewis Merthyr Consolidated made a rational economic decision, accepting the risk of disaster was cheaper than preventing it. They were right, in the narrow terms of their calculation. The disaster cost the company approximately £75,000 in total. Prevention would have cost £20,000 up front plus ongoing maintenance, but the calculation ignored one variable: public outrage. The Senghenydd disaster became a rallying point for mine safety reform, for workers' rights, for holding corporations accountable. It couldn't prevent World War I from delaying those reforms, but it created political momentum that eventually resulted in comprehensive mine safety legislation. The Coal Mines Act amendments of 1920, the improved inspection regimes of the 1930s, the nationalisation of British coal mines in 1947, all can be traced back to the outrage generated by Senghenydd. But that's cold comfort for the 439 dead, their 200 widows, their 500 orphan children. Reforms that came 7 years too late, accountability that never materialized, justice that was never served. The Senghenydd disaster remains the single deadliest mining accident in British history. Its death toll of 439 men represented nearly 10% of Senghenydd's entire population, killed in the space of 45 seconds by an explosion that every expert had predicted. And yet, it was perfectly preventable. Every death was documented in advance by an inspector who knew exactly what would happen. Every violation had been recorded. Every warning had been issued. The disaster occurred not despite the system but because of it, a system that calculated human life in pounds sterling and found the math acceptable. The transformation of British mining safety from mockery of regulations to enforceable standards took exactly 7 years. In that time, the name Senghenydd became synonymous with criminal negligence. Coal executives who had dismissed safety inspectors as alarmists stopped laughing when public outrage made their calculations politically untenable. The memorial in Senghenydd, South Wales, a stone monument, stands in the village centre. Its surface lists 439 names in alphabetical order, but the real story is told in a detail most visitors miss. At the base of the memorial, embedded in stone, is a miner's safety lamp, the same type Edward Shaw carried on October 14, 1913. Next to it, a plaque bears words from William Brace's original report, written 2 months before the disaster. This mine presents significant explosion risk under current conditions. Recommend suspension of operations in affected sections until ventilation is improved. Below that, a single sentence from the company's response dated August 18, 1913. Inspector Brace's concerns are noted. However, we believe this is an excessive response to what has been, to date, a theoretical risk. The Senghenydd disaster began as an inspector's report to be filed away, safety regulations to be mocked as economically unfeasible, ventilation improvements to be deferred, because quarterly profits mattered more than miners' lungs. It ended with 439 men dead, 200 widows, 500 orphans, and an entire industry forced to acknowledge that the cost of negligence, measured in shattered families and empty chairs at dinner tables, exceeded any conceivable profit margin. The mathematics had seemed so clear in the boardrooms of Cardiff: £20,000 to prevent versus £40,000 maximum liability if disaster struck. A rational calculation, an economically defensible decision. What the coal barons hadn't factored into their equations was the weight of 439 names carved into stone, or the political cost of widows testifying before Parliament, or the way a village of 5,000 people looks when nearly 440 of its men never come home. Coal barons had laughed at safety laws in 1913, calling them prohibitively expensive, economically unfeasible, the complaints of alarmist inspectors who didn't understand business realities. They'd toasted their dividends in London clubs, while miners' wives hung laundry in Senghenydd valleys, waiting for husbands who would breathe poison for pennies. By 1920 there were fewer coal barons left to laugh. Public outrage had made their calculations indefensible. Parliamentary reforms had eliminated their legal protections. The memory of 439 names on a stone monument, fathers and sons listed side by side, brothers buried in the same graves, had made their mathematics obsolete. The Coal Mines Act amendments didn't reference profit margins or quarterly earnings, they referenced Edward Shaw and his son George, Thomas Lewis and his mechanical cutter, William Brace and his ignored warnings. 439 miners descended into darkness on October 14, 1913, carrying lunch tins and safety lamps, breathing air that smelled of coal dust and methane, joking about the day's work ahead. 45 seconds later, the explosion had spoken, louder than any boardroom calculation, more final than any cost-benefit analysis, more devastating than any quarterly report. And British mining safety was written in their blood, legislated in their widows' testimonies, enforced by the memory of a village that lost nearly 10% of its population before breakfast was finished. The coal barons had been right about one thing: safety was expensive, they'd just miscalculated whose blood would pay the price. 439 miners descended into darkness on October 14, 1913. The explosion spoke for 45 seconds, and British mining safety was written in their blood.